On February 24, 2022, the Russian Federation declared that they would conduct a special military operation on Ukraine. After over 100 days of fighting, around 50,000 people have died and 15 million have been displaced. But how did this happen? Why are so many people losing their homes, their lives? How did this conflict arise? And to be more precise, what are the historical circumstances and causes that allowed the 2022 Ukrainian-Russian war to occur? The answer is complicated, a complicated series of events over a period of time, and we're starting at the beginning. The Soviet Union was a communist state composed of 15 republics that lasted through most of the 20th century for around 69 years. Ukraine was one of the largest republics within the Soviet Union and contained plenty of resources and power. However, Ukraine has also been known for its strong nationalistic ties and pride in its culture. The republic tried to break away and become independent, like when they tried to make the Ukrainian People's Republic, but that didn't last long. Bearing the weights of the 1932-33 famine, the slaughtering of the Nazi invasion, and the Chernobyl reactor explosion, Ukraine has gone through many horrors under Soviet rule. On August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian Republic claimed its own independence and separated from the Soviet Union, which was dissolved soon after on December 26, 1991. This separation became one of the first causes of what we see happening today. A few years later, another important event occurred. The Budapest Memorandum was an agreement signed by Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine on the 5th of December for security assurances for their contribution to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which is a treaty that wanted to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to promote peace. This memorandum was signed by 3 nuclear powers, the United States, the UK, and the Russian Federation. In the agreement, the memorandum stated that these nations are not allowed to threaten, use military force or economic force to attack Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. In return, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan must give up their nuclear weapons, which they did between 1993 and 1990s. Prior to this, Ukraine had the world's 3rd largest nuclear weapons stockpile. At the time, the agreement for territorial security seemed worthy enough to give up military insurance. However, little did they know that this ended up putting Ukraine at a disadvantage and in a vulnerable position to fight against the very neighbor who claimed they wouldn't attack them. This became another cause for what is happening today. The Maidan uprisings, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, were sets of protests that argued widespread government corruption, the influence of oligarchs, abuse of power, and violation of human rights in Ukraine. Many people would come to protest at the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, or the Independence Square. The protesters created makeshift barricades, built shields and armor out of metal scraps, maintained first aid stations, as well as broadcasting and speech platforms. Eventually, the protests got physical, and the command to let out soldiers was given by President Yanukovych, who was known as one of the most corrupt leaders in the world. Around 100 protesters and 13 police officers were killed. The protesters were honored by the name the Heavenly Hundred, or the Nebesnaya Sotnya. They were also awarded the Hero of Ukraine title. After this, Yanukovych signed an agreement that created an interim government. Shortly after, he and some ministers ran away to Russia. Upon arriving there, as it was found out later in 2019, Yanukovych had asked Vladimir Putin to send in troops to invade Ukraine after he fled the country, which is what had happened. Utilizing the weakened state that Ukraine was in, the Russian Federation proceeded to invade Crimea. Russian troops were sent out as they took control of the parliament as well as strategic sites. Crimea was annexated. Russia established a military presence on the peninsula and made nuclear threats to solidify their claim. Just like that, Crimea became part of Russia on the 18th of March in 2014. Following this, the war in Donbass started. This was an armed conflict that occurred around the same time as the annexation of Crimea. Russian forces seized government facilities throughout the Donbass area and fighting began. This was a war zone, and although a ceasefire was implemented on September of 2014, it was quickly broken in January of 2015, where fighting resumed. The area had been under military conflict since, even leading up to the days before the current war. Corruption of Yanukovych, Maidan, the annexation of Crimea, and war in Donbass were more causes that led to the war that we have now to occur. All of these events weakened the country and allowed the enemy to gain an even bigger advantage. On the 14th of June in 2021, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, held their 31st formal meeting. Within their discussions, they looked at a decision that was made in 2008 by Ukraine to essentially keep their ties with Russia rather than ally with Western organizations. The premise of relooking was to allow Ukraine to make a choice without outside interference and influence by other countries. As said by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, as we will not return to the era of spheres of interest when large countries decide what smaller ones should do. Russia, and namely Putin, did not like this. On various days after this meeting had happened, Putin expressed his concern, from warnings and threats to proposals that will limit the influence of NATO and the US on former Soviet countries to, unfortunately, military action. Day by day, satellite images would come out showing increased military presence near and around Ukraine's border as well as in Belarus. It was then that people began to speculate what could, and eventually did happen next. Had Ukraine joined NATO sooner, maybe this wouldn't have happened. However, we can never know for sure, but what is certain is that this cause was definitely a trigger to start what is now a war. Some other historical reasons for why people argue that the wars happening right now are culture claims. Ukraine and Russia originated from a similar place culturally. It was religion and power that built the Kievan Rus, originated in what now is the heart of Ukraine, Kiev. This empire spread to Moscow to evolve, and with it did people. And although they may have originated from the same place, they became different. They created their own traditions, they spoke their own languages, and they became their own nations. And despite what Putin claims nowadays, saying that they're the same people and should be united together, it is clear that that is not what the people want. It is clear that Ukraine wants to be independent, and that it deserves to be independent. But it is also clear that Putin wants to take their land and create an empire like there once was. After all, according to him, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It is fair to consider Ukraine and Russia's cultural past, as well as Putin's position in power, as some of the other causes to what is happening right now. So, to conclude, there are many reasons to why Russia has invaded Ukraine. Their cultural past, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine giving up their nuclear weapons, Maidan, Crimea, Donbass, NATO, Putin. It is impossible to know what would happen if any of these causes were not present. Maybe there would be no war, maybe there would be another world war, or maybe things would have played out the same way that they are now. We can't know, but what we do know is what happened, and we can try to prevent it from happening in the future. We can hope that leaders learn from past mistakes and hope for the future to be a better place. But for now, all we can do is support those that are losing their homes and suffering due to conflicts that shouldn't be happening. Not just in Ukraine, but all over the world. Thank you.